Hi, everyone. So I'm just waiting for everyone to join and welcome everyone if you're just joining us right now. My name is Eryn and I'm an advisor and host at Raw Talk Podcast. And I've had the privilege of being a part of Raw Talk since our very first season. And I'm very excited to be leading this panel discussion today about starting a podcast with some of my favorite student podcast groups. And so just in terms of the structure of this panel, we'll have about 25 minutes for our panel discussion, and then we'll leave the last 5 to 10 minutes for audience questions. And again, just a quick reminder for the audience to post questions in the chat. And we won't have nearly as many time to answer all the questions, so we'll definitely be answering more of those at the discussion session at the end of the day. And of course, don't forget to check out their booths to learn more about their podcast specifically. And so again, we don't have nearly as much time today, so I won't waste any more time. So I have the pleasure of introducing this wonderful panel. So we have Swapna from Medicine in Motion, and she's also a double representative because she's also part of our Raw Talk team. We have Julia from Rehab Inc., Lee from Accidental Intellectual, and Matthew from Built to Lead. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
And so maybe I'm really curious to ask my first question to all of you. Maybe Lee, I'll start off with you first, but I'm really curious to hear about what your initial idea and vision was for Accidental Intellectual, and yeah, just what was your initial vision with the podcast?
Great question. And I think, initially it was just kind of sparked by the idea that I love conversations with people. I'm training to be a psychologist, and I guess it fits. And I just kind of wanted to dig a little deeper and kind of humanize all the experts. So that's where the idea of kind of turning it into a long form podcast was. And I don't know, maybe I was just nosy, and I just kind of wanted to get to know people on a level beyond what they do professionally, get to know what they do professionally, and then hear about all the journey that went beyond that. So we talk a lot about failure, and I'll probably touch on that on one of the later questions.
Yeah, and that's really wonderful. Matthew, maybe I'll turn to you. Can you tell me about your initial vision with Built to Lead? Oh, I don't know if I can hear you. Maybe we'll move on to Swapna just for a minute while Matthew figures it out with Alex, who's our wizard in the background. So Swapna, can you tell me a little bit about how Medicine in Motion came to be?
Sure. Well, first I want to say I'm super excited that everyone can hear from all of these amazing people from different podcasts because they are super talented. Medicine in Motion podcast came to be because I'm super passionate about sports medicine, and I'm in medical school right now, and that's an area that I'd like to go with my clinical work. But I've often been asked, what does it mean to be a sports medicine physician? Does that mean you're a physiotherapist? Does that mean you're an occupational therapist? What does that mean? And I figured, hey, a podcast might be a really great way to share the information about what do each of these separate but collaborative roles in health and physical activity do, and what does that mean? And maybe feature some careers and some really excellent people who are doing those careers right now.
Thank you for sharing. Matthew, can we hear you now?
Test. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I guess to make a long story short, I was a part of the Vernissage Health program. So that's a program for emerging leaders where we get to connect with established leaders and just to get to hear from some of their stories and understand what it takes to be a leader in today's healthcare system. So I've always been intrigued with leadership and just understanding some people's success stories. So for me, the podcast came about that originally after this program, I was going to do some personal interviews with some leaders in the field just to get an understanding of what made them become a good leader. And then I had a family friend. He was always nagging me to start a podcast. And then I was like, why not turn this self-development podcast into something as like a peer focus? So why not share some of those interviews with some of my classmates and peers so they can learn from it? So that was kind of the vision for the podcast.
What a wonderful story. Julia, can I hear a little bit about the beginnings of Rehab Inc.?
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Just testing, great. So I'm a co-producer along with my partner, Kyla Alsbury-Neely. She's also a graduate student. She's a PhD and I'm an MSc. And so we started it about a year and a half ago now. And we are both really big fans of podcasts. We listen to a lot of them, especially true crime and all different kinds. And our projects also very much focus on knowledge translation. And we're big on trying to make research very accessible to the public and just talking about research findings in lay terms and making it kind of applicable to everyone. And we are from the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute, and sometimes not many people know what rehabilitation is, even though it will affect almost everyone at some point. It involves aging and different neurological disorders and disabilities. So in one way or another, we're all gonna age. We're all gonna, fracture like something in our body at some point. And so we're likely gonna be affected by this stuff. And it was very important to us to try to bring research to an accessible forum and interview different scientists or students or people with lived experience whose experiences and knowledge often gets undermined in the kind of traditional academic structure. So we just wanted to, just have a conversation and also build students up to be able to talk about their research in an easy way to the public. And so, we thought we'd integrate our love for research to our experiences as researchers and really connect with the community.
It's wonderful. And one thing is that I'm just so excited that we have the four of you representing quite diverse areas and just to have this discussion about how your podcast came to be and where you're at now. And I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about, so we started with that initial idea of what you wanted the podcast to be and what were those steps in bringing that to life and really, coming to releasing your first podcast episode. And I'm wondering, Lee, maybe you can start us off and walk us through some of those steps that you took to release your first episode.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, initially first step was beyond the idea, it's just building the team. So finding some people who, you trust and you'd like to work with. In my case, it was mainly people from my program, also just friends who are in the field, who are in graduate studies at U of T, and also we have some members from York University. And it was really just bringing people on board. People were keen to get involved, which was lovely. And then it was just kind of breaking down all the steps. So we just had to start to look into it. We got a lot of guidance from you guys over at Raw Talk, which was really lovely. And just like, what are all the steps? So like things like getting equipment, learning about hosting platforms, setting up interviews, getting guests lined up, and then the music. And it was really just about asking people. I think you kind of have to be a little bit shameless in that sense. Like our music, if you've ever listened to any of the episodes, was done by a former neighbor of mine who was a musician, and she was super keen to kind of put a little jingle together for us. The artwork is by one of our team member Harrison's brother, who's a graphic designer. So it was really just kind of gathering a lot, and asking people for help. And people were kind of getting on board, and things just kind of spiraled from there.
And Matthew, you're a little bit newer. Can you tell me a little bit about some of those steps that it took from your wonderful idea to bringing it to fruition?
So at the first, a lot of it was just like research. So it was like listening to a lot of podcasts, what I like about them, what I don't like. I even went into the details in terms of like listening to how the length of the intro, outros, just to say how we format it. So it will depend on the type of podcast form you're doing. So if it's interview based, or if you're doing kind of like a banter talk. So a lot of YouTube. So like Pat Flynn was one. Buzzsprout is one of those podcasting hosting services. They have a podcast series. So I was doing a lot of listening to that. And then once I started developing the ideas, like as Lee was saying, you guys are talking about, like, teamwork makes the dream work. So it's trying to build that team, because doing it by yourself is really difficult. So luckily through the Vernissage Health programs, we're partnering with them. And Wendy, one of my mentors, she was able to help me find my co-host. So that was just amazing, because I was able to build off her strength and then going into recruiting the guests. So you just make a list of all the guests that you think you want. And I would just tell people, like, reach for the stars too, in terms of the guests, because you don't know who you can actually get because of that 6 degrees of separation. So don't limit yourself in terms of the guests you have. So that's something we did. And then one thing too is that in terms of the research, when you're meeting with the guests on those interviews, it's always good to do the research on the guests itself, because they really appreciate that knowledge about them. So I think that helps with the the conversation.
Mhm. And what both of you are saying in terms of research and collaboration and reaching out, those are all sort of putting our graduate student skills to use, I think. Julia, do you have any comments about the initial steps that you took to releasing your first podcast episode?
Yeah, I guess we were a bit lucky in our finding the team aspect of things. So our podcast really kind of a love child of two other initiatives that both my partner and I have already been involved in. One she was a bit more involved in, and that was organizing a speaker series and recruiting individuals to speak on very relevant topics in medicine, public health, and rehabilitation. And then I was a bit more involved in the Rehab Inc. magazine, which publishes 2 issues annually and showcases research that is done by our graduate students. And so we kind of morphed both into this podcast where we try to, well, one, adopt some of the goals of the magazine, which was to showcase research, and also adopt some of the speaker series goals and aims, which was to make research accessible and talk about it in an accessible way. And so we thought, well, the speaker series events are so great, but they kind of happen, and if you can't attend, they're gone. And so we thought, well, why don't we just make this kind of combine the two and make those events not just gone and more accessible to people long term, so they don't have to attend the events. And so our first episode was kind of a no-brainer, where we, Kyla and I, we just recapped one of our first speaker series events on women and brain health, and we kind of discussed our takeaways from that. And we started with that one, and it was much easier than I think coming up with a whole like brand new outline. So we had content to work from, and then we also then moved into a COVID-19 miniseries, which was also really interesting and fun, and we got some funding for that. So that really helped us out financially, because I think one of the struggles is like equipment. We don't have much, and so it really helped. And a lot of actually funding opportunities don't allow you to claim equipment. So it was a bit of a struggle to find an opportunity where we could kind of propose to spend the budget on equipment. But what helped us definitely is kind of already having been friends. So it was easy to be co-partners in this initiative. And also the individuals who are involved in the magazine and the speaker series, a lot of them kind of naturally gravitated towards this new project. So we've already had a team more or less set up.
So perfect convergence of all of the things that you were doing. Swapna, can you tell me a bit about the steps that you took to create Medicine in Motion?
Sure. I think it's a bit of a similar story to Julia with that convergence. And I like what Matthew was saying about teamwork makes the dream work, because my first step was bringing that initial idea, to a friend that I was also working with in a group called Exercises Medicine. And that really entailed like an embodied vision that I had for the podcast. And that is also where we recruited our team, especially for the first season. That was a group where we had a lot of people who had a lot of interest in sport medicine and exercise as medicine and promoting health in all of those ways with physical activity. So it was the perfect place to get that team. And now it worked out great, because we continue to have recruitment through Exercises Medicine, and Mackenzie McLaughlin is also the co-founder and now also the co-executive producer with me. So that turned out great. The next step we took was to talk to Richie. So everybody already did that step by listening to Richie's presentation. I feel like Raw Talk Podcast is the mama podcast for our podcast, and it sounds like a lot of podcasts, and through this festival, likely a lot more podcasts. Richie took us through the how-to of how to start a podcast. We also talked to Jabir, the other co-founder of Raw Talk Podcast, and from their advice, the next step after that we took was to create our plans. So we had everything written out and planned out in place. So that was our tools, what kind of equipment we were going to use, what our mission was specifically, so that we could stay focused, who our target audience was, so that we could, again, stay focused, but also make sure that we were doing something relevant to them specifically. Plan a few of our episodes and the format that we were going to do, and really create what our why was. Like, why are we doing this podcast? What is it really that we want to achieve, and figure out what our niche was. So that was very helpful to sort out before we even started recording or figuring out our guest list.
And definitely some of those things that Richie was touching on in the previous session. And so now I guess we're to the point where you're about to release your first episode, and I'm just so curious as to what all of you were feeling just the night before your first episode launch. What was going through your mind? Maybe Julie, I'll start off with you for this one.
Yeah, we actually recorded, I think, in like the summer, and then we didn't have many people to help us with the audio editing. We were like really early on, and we weren't even sure like what we were gonna do with the episode really, and so I don't think we got to editing it until December, so it sat there for like several months. So we weren't as excited, I guess, as like, you know, right after you record and it's fresh and you're right there. So we took us a while to find some people to help us get it out there. And then, yeah, and once we finally had kind of more individuals involved and people who were willing to learn how Audacity or whatever other software works, then things kind of kicked off the ground. And yeah, and we edited and we released and we were very excited, but we also realized like this was we'll see what is even going to happen with it. We don't know yet, because it was just so new to us all, and none of us have any previous podcasting experience. So I think we just at one point we're like, okay, we can't edit this anymore. It just needs to get out there, and so that we can move on to the next episode. And yeah, I think we were all just very excited and keeping our eyes on the numbers and trying to promote as best we could. And we got all our parents to listen and everything like that. So it was just very exciting to like have your voice out there. I think yeah, is one of the first initial thoughts.
Definitely resonate with that, with being like, we just need to stop right now. We can't edit this any further. We just got to put it out there. Lee, can you tell me about you know, what you were feeling the night before your first episode release?
Yeah, I think myself, and I think I could probably speak for the rest of the team, is we were all pretty excited. It was a lot of hard work. It was kind of the culmination of a lot of hard work. The first episode we actually released 2 at once. Both I think were quite like with the guests on the podcast shared very personal stories, which really resonated with sort of the theme of what we were going for. And I think we just kind of had to put it out there. In terms of the editing and sort of like stopping ourselves, our episodes are obviously edited as well as we can for sound quality, but they are deliberately kind of unfiltered because we do want to sort of really honor the fallible nature of human beings. So you often hear me or co-hosts or even the guests kind of just like slip up, kind of lose their train of thought, and we deliberately leave some of that in, and we kind of hope that it helps to sort of share the message that there is absolutely no perfect people. There's no perfect podcast, but we just want to kind of highlight the humanity that we all share.
And I certainly appreciate that from your podcast and what you share with the world. Matthew, what were you feeling the night before your podcast, your first podcast was released?
Yeah, similar to Julia, we did a lot of our recordings in the spring and the summer. We actually didn't release it into the fall. But for our first season, we kind of did things backwards. So we had 5 episodes, and our season finale, we did a live launch event. So that, I think that was more anxious because all the episodes were released afterwards. And since it's only audio, you're not really live, so you don't necessarily have to worry about, let's say, looking at people's faces if they're not listening. So I think it's a lot easier just to release the episode. So I think I was more anxious with the live, just moderating that live event, because we had some pretty big hitters in the healthcare space. So we had the CEO of Ontario Health and Camille Orridge, and she does a lot of stuff in the system too. So that was more anxious. So once all the episodes released after that live event, I think I was just more excited to have the world like at least hear the product that we came up with.
Swapna, do you have any further thoughts to share?
Yeah, I think just like everyone here, we were nervous, we were excited. We were nervous partly because very beginning, we didn't have anybody who is solely dedicated to audio engineering. So a couple of us, including myself, had to pick it up, and we had never done that before. So it was kind of nerve-wracking and a nail-biting time. So that's where we were a little bit nervous, but the excitement, we were just so proud of our team. We learned to like just lean into the passions of our team. We didn't realize that we had people who were really great at graphic design and great at all these other things. So we had a logo that we were, as a team, super proud of, the product we were very proud of. So it was a very, very exciting time to make that launch. And it was January at that time in that year. So it was, it was called New Year, New You. And it was just a very exciting time for us to make that change.
Definitely. And I'm just wondering about, the first couple of months when all of your podcasts were starting out, what were some of those, maybe Matthew, I'll start with you for this one. What were some of the biggest challenges or hiccups that you faced in those first couple of months?
I think the biggest challenge for us was COVID-19, because we just started it before it actually, let's say, hit. So we were just in the middle of booking a lot of our guests, and then we just had to cancel and postpone a lot of them. And then we're just, me and Sarah, my co-host, we were kind of sitting on the podcast for 2 months because I guess everyone's dealing with other things. And then we just had to realize, okay, we can pivot to doing Zoom online recordings, because the same family friend, he had some of the podcast equipment. So we were relying on him, and we didn't necessarily know, okay, how can we continue this? We want to keep this high quality of audio, but we decided we still want to get this product out. We have to pivot during this time because there's no in-person. So I think that was just the biggest challenge, just changing that mindset.
Definitely. Julia, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced, you and your team faced in the first couple of months?
Yeah, for us, it was like, what wasn't a challenge? That's a much shorter list. We definitely had, as Swapna mentioned, like we didn't have a dedicated person to do audio engineering. We didn't really have a dedicated person to do like the online release. So, and we also didn't have much of a budget. So we kind of relied on the free trials on a lot of the software and platforms. And also, as Lee mentioned, we also had to come up with a jingle. And actually, Kyla and her partner, they came up with one. They have some musical instruments, so that was a fun creative process. So that was great. And we also had to sit down and really think about our mission and how we're going to stand apart from the 2 other projects that we emerged from, and what was going to be like our the point of our podcast, and how to stay focused on that and not dwell too far. As I mentioned, our first episode was about summarizing a speaker series event, but we wanted, like, those speaker series aren't forever, and so we needed to produce our own content as well. So we had to really sit down and think about that. And one very helpful task was when we applied for grants or funding. Like, that usually requires very specific aims and what we're all about. So that really made us think and put things down on paper that we still refer to this day. So that was very helpful. Yeah, and as we acquired more individuals and put out calls for people with certain specialties, we certainly became more cohesive, and we started functioning better, and we developed like a schedule and stuff like that. But and the funding, of course, with recording equipment certainly helped as well. But yeah, I think it was a very long learning process for everyone. But I think if everyone is excited and everyone is passionate about the podcast, I think that's the main ingredient, because then you're willing to spend the time on it, even when you're tired and you're so busy with your graduate or other school studies. And it's really something that you have to be passionate about. Otherwise, you're not gonna prioritize it, and it's not gonna work.
Definitely. And I think something that we've just already heard today many times is just that creating a podcast is a labor of love. And so it's always an evolving learning process. Swapna, what were some of the biggest challenges for you when you first started out?
I think it's a really good question. I think I'll share 3 challenges and one thing that helped with each of those challenges. The first challenge was audio engineering, because none of us on our team had ever done it before. And for the first episode, that for the majority of it kind of fell to me, and I am not savvy with technology at all whatsoever. At least that's what I believed until I tried it. And then I went, oh, I can do this. So my advice for you, if you're in the same boat, believe in yourself, because you can do it. You can learn. The next thing that was a challenge was funding, especially starting out. And I have to say that partnerships very much helped with that. So we ended up getting funding from different places that we didn't really expect to get it from. We got it from a physiotherapy grant that first year, and that really helped with things like equipment and all of the the places where we need to put our funding toward like promotion. And then the last one that we had challenges with was finding a space to record. So we were doing this on campus, and we were very grateful to have access to places in order to record. But we did notice that, and I've never noticed this, like how noisy spaces can be until we started recording in spaces. There would be noisy radiators or rattling windows or just something that you would be able to pick up on the audio. And so I wish that I knew a tip that I learned more recently from speaking with Cara Santamaria, who is a host on a number of different fantastic podcasts, and she's an incredible podcaster. She said to us that one of the really easy things that you can do is record in a place like your closet, because it kind of dampens the sounds that you don't want to hear. Now that a lot of us are doing this from home, record from your closet. Or what I ended up doing was like hanging sweaters on either side of where I was recording, and it did help. So those are I think 3 things that I would recommend.
What were some of the biggest challenges that your team faced in the first couple of months?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll echo the sentiments that everyone else shared. I think funding is always, especially in any student project, podcast or otherwise, is a big challenge. We ended up kind of last year piecing together a number of U of T grants, which was helpful, and some from York University as well. I think other than what everyone else has already shared, I think like, I don't know if I'd call it a challenge, but just sort of a learning curve of workflow. Sort of, it took a while for everyone to kind of fall into the roles that they now have, and especially as our team grew, we had to kind of rethink about where we needed more hands and eyes. And I think it's really about getting a little bit better at delegating, and it speaks a lot to working with a team who you trust and you know is going to sort of put out a good project, and you just have to learn to sort of step back. No one can have their hand in every piece of the project. And if you work with a team that you know well and trust, you don't really feel the need to. So I think just, it just takes a while. You get the hang of it, and here we are.
Yes, you are. So maybe I'll just move on to some audience questions. I didn't really get the chance to ask all of my questions, but maybe they'll overlap. And actually, this one speaks to your point, Lee. The question is, I'm curious about your time management. In an average week, how do you balance between working on the podcast and grad studies? Does anyone want to have the first word for this one?
I think for us at Built to Leave, when I was in school, and my co-host for the first season, Sarah, is kind of understanding everyone's schedule and trying to work around that. So we know school's focus, but then making sure that we're finding time and having enough like runway to be able to finish stuff. So making sure like we have timelines. I think Richie was talking about like set dates. So that helps a lot. Like have recurrent meetings to make sure like this is something that you're going to focus on. So that helps you stay in the flow. So I think that kind of helped us out with the workflow.
Julia, do you have any further thoughts?
Yeah, we also have a schedule, and we try to have very set dates, but we also try to be very flexible. So even if something comes up to someone, we're flexible to delay the release by a week or two, so that it's not super difficult on us. And then we certainly have certain roles that people tend to do. And so someone who usually does the audio engineering, someone who usually does the like the social media graphics production and such. But we also have some floaters. So in case, and people that know 2 things. So no one, we're trying to have no one knowing just one thing, so that just in case if someone does need to step out or becomes exceptionally busy, we do have someone else to step in and help out with that. So that's really helped. And and we try to lean on each other as much as we can. So yeah.
Lee, do you have any further thoughts on how you're able to balance all the different hats that you're wearing, including, of course, running your own podcast?
Yeah, I think we use tools like we have a shared Google Calendar, and it's really helpful for booking the interviews and meetings and other things like little reminders, which is great. And it's just really advanced thinking. Like we do release episodes bi-weekly, and we've been pretty good. We stuck to that schedule. We haven't missed a release date in the seasons. And that's a real testament to like we have a whole bunch of interviews like already recorded, and they sort of we get the editing process going so that it's never well, I shouldn't say never. At the beginning, it might have been like kind of to the wire, but we try our best not to, so that it's not a huge amount of work the night before for people who might have other things to do, and helping each other out, right? If someone has their job, but they're also really struggling with time because they have a whole bunch of other things that week, we pick up the slack for each other, which is a great part about working with a great team.
Definitely. Swapna, I know you definitely wear a million hats. How do you balance wearing all those different hats and prioritizing the podcast in addition to everything else?
I think that's a really good question, and I'm going to be echoing a lot of what everyone here is saying, including what Lee just said about having a great team who really does pick up the slack for each other when they need to. But it really does come down for us to an adaptable schedule. So we have a schedule. I personally live by lists, and I love checking it off and knowing what is coming up and when I need to do things. But at the same time, things happen, especially in the pandemic. We do need to be adaptable, both for our members themselves as well as for our guests. I think that we found that having an adaptable schedule was exactly the way for us to go, especially this season.
Okay, so I think most of the other questions have been answered in the chat or covered by what we've already discussed. Maybe I'll just take the final question. And I'm just curious, Lee, maybe I'll start off with you for this one. Just thinking about where your podcast is now, how does it compare to what you initially envisioned it to be, and how do you feel about it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think aside from just a general idea, I didn't really have much. The actually putting it into action is a testament to the really wonderful team that I work with. But I think it was Matthew who said this at the beginning. It's really shoot for the stars. Like, we've had some pretty phenomenal guests on the show, and that has really been wonderful for all of our learning. Like, we've been able to sit down in the same room, and now with COVID, obviously, on a Zoom call, with some real movers and shakers in the field, and it's a really valuable experience. So if you think someone's going to be interesting to interview, shoot them an email. They just might say yes.
Yeah, you'll be surprised how many people answer to your cold emails. Julia, I'm curious about you and where does the podcast fit now versus where you envisioned it to be initially?
Yeah, I think it's very much still in kind of the place where Kyla and I have envisioned it. We are still very much focused on making research very accessible. We're interviewing clinicians and other researchers and people with lived experience and trying to integrate as many perspectives as possible. And so I don't think it's actually shifted much, but I know we are still evolving, and every now and then, we're thinking of having different mini series on different topics. And I think that with more perspectives and new people coming on here and there, we're really starting to become more efficient, and we're trying to have new ideas come on every time. So yeah, I think we're still evolving, but I think the central aim is still intact and will probably remain intact, because I think that's very central to our department as is. So yeah.
Definitely. I'm mindful of time, but I'm curious, Matthew, if you have any final thoughts on that.
Yeah, just quickly in terms of the vision, I think the team grow, because even I have Megan here, Logan, who's in the house. So it's just good to see that. Those that are
cutting out.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I was just saying, in terms of the vision, I always seen it as like a two-pronged approach. So development for the students that are part of the process, and also for the students that are listening to it. So it's good, because last season we talked about self-doubt, to confidence, imposter syndrome. So that's something that I was hearing a lot from my peers. So this season we're looking to like health leadership mindset. So it's just good to see that we're growing and that there's more interest.
Wonderful. Swapna, do you have any final thoughts?
I'll try and make this super quick. I think our podcast has become so much more than I could have ever envisioned it to be. And I think that's a wonderful testament to the incredible team that we have. And we didn't expect, an international reach in our first year, but when we got it, that really motivated us to just keep going and make it bigger and better. And I just want to reiterate what of the panel has said today, which is reach with what you think that you can do, and also get to know the network that you have now. Like, think about your podcast at the back of your mind always, because some of our most incredible guests were already in our network and we didn't know it. For example, the second woman to ever run a marathon in Canada, who comes from a town, just so ironically and really cool, called Marathon Ontario. And her story was so amazing. She ran at a time when women were discouraged from running, and it was very inspiring. And little did we know, she was already in our network.
You never know who you're connected to. And so thank you all so much for attending this panel, and thank you to all of our panelists for engaging in this wonderful discussion. And of course, I think some of you might be attending the discussion session at the end of the day today. So for any of the questions that we didn't get to, we'll be able to answer those then. And don't forget to check out their booths. And so our next session will begin in about 8 minutes at 3:10 with Grace and Melissa, our wonderful former co-executive producers, discussing team workflow and logistics. And so we look forward to seeing you at the end of the day at the discussion session.